Shaquille O'Neal never expected to be accused of stealing his own truck. But when the cops refused to believe him, things took a shocking turn. As the real thief made his move, Shaq uncovered a deeper conspiracy, one that went far beyond a stolen vehicle. Framed, betrayed, and forced to fight back, he had no choice but to expose the truth. But what he discovered? It changed everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq, walked through the streets like a gentle giant, his presence both commanding and comforting. Wherever he went, heads turned, not out of intimidation, but admiration. A group of kids playing basketball on a cracked public court stopped mid-game to stare as he approached. Without hesitation, Shaq stepped onto the court, dribbling a ball between his massive hands with surprising grace. "Y'all hoopin' or what?" he asked, a wide grin spreading across his face. The kids erupted in excitement. They had seen him on TV, in commercials, even on the news, but standing in front of them? That was different. Shaq played for a while, blocking shots effortlessly, laughing when the kids exaggerated their attempts to score against him. He lifted one of the youngest up, letting him dunk. The kid's face lit up, and for a moment, the whole world seemed perfect. After signing a few jerseys and taking selfies, Shaq walked over to a nearby food truck. The owner, a man named Leon, greeted him with a handshake that barely wrapped around Shaq's fingers. "Shaq, you know you don't gotta pay, man. You keep my business alive just by being here," Leon said, laughing. "Nah, man," Shaq replied, handing over a few crisp bills. "We support each other. That's how it's gotta be." Leon shook his head, but he took the money. As Shaq bit into a loaded burger, he noticed a woman sitting on the curb, her face lined with exhaustion, clutching a small child wrapped in a thin blanket. The city was beautiful, but it had its shadows, places where dreams got lost, where people slipped through the cracks. Shaq crouched down beside the woman, handing her his food and pulling out his wallet. "Take this," he said gently, placing several $100 bills in her hand. "Get yourself something good today. You're not alone." Tears welled up in her eyes, but before she could speak, he patted her shoulder and walked away. He didn't do it for recognition. He didn't do it for the cameras. He did it because that's who he was. Despite the warmth of the day, there was a chill in the air, a strange weight that clung to the edges of the city. As Shaq made his way to his truck, a custom-made, oversized beast of a vehicle, he felt it. A shift, a moment of quiet that didn't belong. A few feet away, two men stood at the entrance of a coffee shop, their conversation hushed. One of them, a wiry guy in a leather jacket, shot a quick glance at Shaq before whispering something to his companion. The other man, taller, lean with sharp features, nodded, his eyes lingering just a second too long. Shaq had seen enough of the world to recognize when someone was talking about him. He ignored it for now, climbing into his truck, but the feeling stuck with him. He had places to be. His next stop was a youth center in South Central. This wasn't some PR stunt. He had been funding this place for years, making sure kids had somewhere safe to go. He walked in, and the room lit up. Kids ran up to him, their laughter bouncing off the walls. The staff greeted him with warmth, grateful for his continued support. He spent hours there, sitting in small plastic chairs that looked comically undersized beneath him, listening to their stories. Some of these kids had seen more hardship in their short lives than most adults ever would. He made sure they knew they mattered. As the evening crept closer, he finally headed toward his last stop of the day, a high-end steakhouse in downtown LA, a place where he could unwind, have a good meal, maybe even see a few friends. But as he parked his truck outside, he noticed something strange. Across the street, under the dim glow of a streetlight, the same two men from earlier were standing there. This time, they weren't whispering. They were watching. Shaq narrowed his eyes but said nothing. He was used to attention, but this felt different. Calculated. Brushing off the unease, he stepped inside the restaurant, greeted by familiar faces. The staff welcomed him, the manager personally leading him to his usual table. He ordered his favorite steak, laughing as he scrolled through his phone, responding to texts from old teammates. Everything seemed normal. But outside, something was shifting. Minutes before Shaq finished his meal, A police car rolled up next to his truck. The officer inside stepped out, pacing around the vehicle, inspecting it like something was off. The two men from earlier were nowhere to be seen. Shaq walked out of the restaurant, his mind still on the good food and the day's events. He was halfway to his truck when he heard the voice behind him. "Sir, step away from the vehicle." Shaq turned, surprised to see a uniformed officer standing by the driver's side door. The badge glinted under the streetlight, the officer's hand resting lightly on his holstered gun. Shaq frowned. "This my truck," he said, his voice calm but firm. The officer's expression remained unreadable. "We got a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description." For the first time all day, Shaq felt something deep in his chest. An unsettling pull. He had lived long enough, seen enough to know that no amount of fame, money, or goodwill could change the way some people saw him. A black man standing next to a luxury truck in a city where not everyone believed he belonged. Another officer stepped out of the squad car, this one younger, his eyes flickering with uncertainty as he glanced at Shaq. A small crowd had started to form, onlookers pulling out their phones, whispering amongst themselves. Shaq took a slow breath, keeping his voice steady. "I got the registration in the glove compartment. Let me grab it." The first officer, the one in charge, shook his head. "Step away from the vehicle," he repeated, this time firmer. Shaq felt the weight of every eye on him. And just like that, the perfect day had cracked, revealing the storm beneath. The restaurant buzzed with the low hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter from a distant table. The scent of aged steak and rich wine filled the air, but Shaq was only half focused on his meal. His mind still lingered on the children's hospital visit earlier that afternoon. The way the kids' eyes had lit up when he walked in, how their laughter had filled the sterile hallways. Moments like that reminded him why he did what he did. He had finished his meal, signed a few napkins for excited patrons, and exchanged a few words with the manager before stepping outside. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the bustling street. His custom luxury truck, a sleek, oversized beauty fitted with top-of-the-line modifications, sat where he had parked it, reflecting the last light of the day. But something was off. A police cruiser was parked directly behind his truck, its lights flashing faintly, casting red and blue hues across the pavement. Beside his vehicle stood a cop, tall, broad-shouldered, with a crisp uniform that seemed too rigid, too tight, as if the man inside it carried more than just authority. His nameplate read, Briggs. Shaq slowed his pace, a small frown forming on his face. Maybe it was just a routine patrol. Maybe the cop was waiting for someone else. Then Briggs turned, his eyes locking onto Shaq's, sharp and calculating. "Sir, step away from the vehicle," the officer commanded, his voice carrying a weight that wasn't just about law enforcement. It was about control. Shaq blinked, the words taking a moment to settle. He let out a chuckle, one that wasn't forced but came from genuine confusion. "Step away? That's my truck, man." Briggs didn't react. His stance remained stiff, his fingers grazing the edge of his belt where his holster sat. "We got a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description." Shaq's amusement faded slightly. He glanced at the truck, then back at the officer. "Nah, that's a mistake. I've been inside for about an hour. You can check the registration if you want. It's in the glove box." Briggs's eyes didn't waver. "I said step away from the vehicle." Shaq exhaled slowly, lifting his hands slightly in a gesture of patience. He had been in situations like this before. He knew how they played out. A misunderstanding, maybe a little ego from the cop, and then everything would settle. "It's all good," Shaq said, his voice calm, measured. "I got proof of ownership. No big deal." Another cruiser pulled up. Then another. The air around him thickened. More officers stepped out, each one assessing the scene with quiet judgment. A few passers-by had begun to stop, their heads turning as whispers spread through the crowd. Shaq glanced around, his stomach tightening. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. Briggs took a step closer. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one last time. Step away from the vehicle." Shaq clenched his jaw. He knew how quickly these things could spiral. Knew that it didn't matter if you were famous, rich, or respected, because at the end of the day, some people only saw one thing. a big black man standing next to an expensive truck. A younger officer standing behind Briggs shifted uncomfortably. His name tag read Holloway, and unlike Briggs, he didn't look certain. His eyes darted between Shaq and the growing crowd, as if questioning whether they had just stepped into something bigger than they intended. Shaq lowered his hands, but kept his posture relaxed. "Look, man, we can solve this real quick. Let me reach in, grab the papers, and we'll be done. No need for all this." Briggs shook his head. "Not happening. Hands where I can see them." A murmur rippled through the crowd. People recognized Shaq now. Some pulled out their phones. "You serious right now?" Shaq asked, his patience thinning. Briggs's jaw tightened. "Either step back, or I'll have to detain you for further questioning." "Detain?" Shaq stared at him, reading everything in the man's expression, the flicker of something deeper than duty, the way his lips pressed together like he had been waiting for an excuse to say those words. Shaq had spent years being the gentle giant, laughing things off, shrugging off moments like these. But now, as he stood there, a crowd gathering, cameras recording, and cops surrounding him like a threat, something burned in his chest. Briggs reached for his radio. "We might need additional units for—" Before he could finish, another officer's radio crackled. A call came in. A stolen vehicle, same make, same color, same modifications as Shaq's truck, had just been reported 2 blocks away. For a second, there was silence. The younger officer, Holloway, turned to Briggs. "Sir, that means this vehicle—" Briggs cut him off. "We're still investigating." Shaq let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, now we're investigating." The crowd murmured louder. Someone yelled, "We all know what this is." Another voice added, "Man, that's Shaq." "What are y'all doing?" Briggs's fingers twitched near his belt, his face stone cold. He wasn't going to let this go. Shaq knew it. The crowd knew it. Shaq took a deep breath. He could argue, could push back, but what would it change? Would it de-escalate anything? He wasn't afraid. He had been through worse, but he also knew the power of perception, how one wrong move, one wrong reaction, could turn him into the aggressor in the eyes of the people in uniform. And so, with every muscle in his body screaming against it, he took a step back. Briggs nodded, as if he had won something. "Good. Now keep your hands visible while we sort this out." The cameras were rolling. The headlines were already writing themselves, and somewhere, not too far away, the real thief was slipping through the city, unnoticed. Shaq exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. His massive frame towered over the officers, but he made no sudden moves. His hands remained in clear view as he gestured toward his truck. "Look, the registration is in the glove compartment," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "Let me show you, and this will all be over." Briggs didn't budge. His expression remained unreadable, but his stance was one of control, authority stretched thin over an ego unwilling to bend. "We'll get to that," Briggs said. "For now, step over here." He pointed toward the sidewalk, further away from the truck. Shaq's patience thinned. "Man, I told you that's my truck. You just got a call about another stolen one. You got the wrong guy." "Maybe," Briggs said, his eyes flickering with something Shaq didn't like. "Maybe not. We're still investigating." By now, 3 more officers had arrived, standing at angles that suggested strategy, not safety. Their hands rested near their holsters, their radios buzzing with static. The air felt heavier, charged with an unspoken tension that had nothing to do with a missing vehicle. A small crowd had gathered. People murmured, some pulling out their phones, whispering to one another. They knew who he was. Everyone did, but that didn't seem to matter. "Man, that's Shaq," someone said from the sidewalk. "Why are they treating him like that?" A woman with her phone raised took a step closer. "Shaq, you good?" Shaq nodded slightly, but didn't take his eyes off the officers. He had seen how fast things could go sideways. Briggs wasn't done. "You got any ID on you?" Shaq resisted the urge to laugh. "Yeah, man, I do, but I shouldn't have to prove who I am. You already know." Briggs didn't respond. One of the younger officers, Holloway, shifted uneasily, but said nothing. Shaq let out a slow breath, then reached into his back pocket, slowly, deliberately, pulling out his wallet. He handed over his driver's license. Briggs took it, studied it for longer than necessary, then passed it off to another officer. The man walked back to the patrol car, radioing something in. "This is ridiculous," Shaq muttered, shaking his head. But Briggs wasn't finished. "Where were you earlier today?" Shaq frowned. "What?" "You heard me," Briggs said, tilting his head slightly. "Where were you today before coming here?" Shaq narrowed his eyes. "You trying to play detective now? I was at the children's hospital. You want to check with them?" Briggs held his gaze. "Just doing my job." Shaq scoffed. "Your job is wasting time while the real thief is out there?" The officer who had taken his license returned, his expression neutral. "It checks out," he said. "Shaquille O'Neal. Everything matches." For a moment, Shaq thought that would be the end of it. The logical thing would be for them to step back, admit the mistake, and move on. But logic had left the situation a long time ago. Briggs took a step forward, his posture still rigid. "You mind opening the truck for us?" Shaq's nostrils flared. "Why?" "Because," Briggs said, "if you have nothing to hide, this should be easy." Shaq let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, that's how we doing it now?" Cameras were rolling. News vans had begun pulling up, reporters scrambling to set up as producers barked orders into headsets. A microphone-wielding journalist pushed forward, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the growing crowd. "Shaq, are they accusing you of stealing your own vehicle?" The question echoed through the street, carried by the energy of a situation spiraling out of control. Shaq rubbed a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. This was becoming something else entirely. He could see the headlines forming, the social media outrage waiting to erupt. Briggs ignored the media presence, his focus locked on Shaq. "Are you going to open the truck or not?" Shaq looked at him for a long moment, then reached into his pocket, pulling out the keys. He hit the unlock button, and the truck let out a quiet beep. "There. Satisfied?" Briggs stepped forward, pulling the door open, peering inside. Shaq clenched his jaw as the officer casually glanced through the interior, his hands hovering near the compartments. "You looking for something?" Shaq asked, his voice low. Briggs ignored him. After a few seconds, he stepped back, shutting the door. "You're free to go." The words didn't feel like relief. They felt like an insult, like something had been taken from him in the past 20 minutes. Shaq stared at Briggs for a moment longer, then shook his head. He turned to the cameras, the crowd, the strangers who had all just witnessed something that shouldn't have happened. "This what we do now," he said, his voice carrying, controlled but firm. "Even when you got money, got a name, they still make you feel like you don't belong." The crowd murmured, some nodding, others recording, waiting for him to say more. But Shaq was tired. Without another word, he climbed into his truck, started the engine, and drove off, leaving behind flashing lights, cameras, and a reminder that sometimes fame didn't matter at all. Shaq's grip on the steering wheel was tight as he drove away from the flashing lights and murmuring crowd. His truck, the same vehicle that had nearly gotten him detained, rumbled smoothly beneath him as the city lights flickered across its hood. The frustration sat heavy in his chest, but he swallowed it down. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and deep down, he knew it wouldn't be the last. His phone buzzed on the dashboard, vibrating against the leather. He tapped the speaker button, not taking his eyes off the road. "You good, big man?" It was Donovan Reese, an old friend and sports journalist who had a habit of knowing things before they even hit the news cycle. "Define good," Shaq muttered. "I just saw the clips, man. It's everywhere. They really did you like that?" Shaq sighed, rolling his shoulders back as if trying to shake off the weight of what had happened. "Yeah, man. They don't care who you are. You know how it goes." There was silence on the other end before Donovan spoke again, voice quieter now. "You want me to run a piece on it? Expose them?" Shaq thought about it for a moment. He wasn't sure what exposing them would do besides stir more outrage, more debates, more noise. And noise didn't fix things. It never did. "Nah," Shaq finally said. "Not yet." Another buzz, this time from his truck's dashboard system. Breaking news alert. He glanced at the screen, eyebrows pulling together as he read the headline. Another luxury truck stolen in downtown LA. Same make and model as Shaquille O'Neal's vehicle. Shaq let out a slow breath. So there it was. The real stolen truck. The one they should have been looking for instead of surrounding him in a parking lot. He tapped the screen, pulling up the live report. The news anchor's voice filled the cabin. Reported stolen just moments ago from outside a private event in West Hollywood. Authorities believe the theft may be connected to a string of high-end vehicle crimes that have targeted celebrities and wealthy business owners across the city. No suspects have been identified at this time. Shaq shook his head, gripping the wheel tighter. All that time wasted on him. And now, the real thief was long gone. Across the city, beneath the glow of a flickering street lamp, a figure stood watching the news through the window of a bar. His black hoodie was pulled low over his face, the dim light casting sharp shadows across his smirking lips. His hands, covered in black gloves, slipped into his pockets as he rocked back on his heels, amused by what he was hearing. Same make, same model, same modifications, the anchor repeated. The man chuckled under his breath. Perfect. The city was a chessboard, and he had just moved a piece that no one saw coming. Back at the station, Officer Holloway sat in front of a computer screen, staring at the new report. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he glanced toward Briggs, who was still at his desk, jaw tight, eyes flicking between his paperwork and the news update. Holloway hesitated, then spoke. Sir, the stolen truck. It's the exact one we should have been looking for instead of wasting time on O'Neal. Briggs didn't look up. He just kept writing. And maybe we should have handled that differently, Holloway said carefully. We could have lost valuable time. Briggs's pen stilled, his shoulders tensing. He exhaled through his nose, then slowly set the pen down before finally meeting Holloway's gaze. You questioning how I handled things? Holloway swallowed. No, sir, I'm just saying. Briggs leaned forward, his tone dropping. Then don't say anything at all. Holloway clenched his jaw, nodding stiffly before looking away. He could feel the weight of the unspoken truth between them. They had messed up. Bad. And now the real thief was out there, running free. Shaq pulled into his driveway, his home standing like a quiet fortress against the night. He stepped out of the truck, stretching his back as the cool air brushed against his skin. But just as he reached for the door handle, a feeling crawled up his spine. Someone was watching. He turned his head slightly, scanning the street. Nothing out of the ordinary, no strange cars, no movement. But that didn't mean no one was there. He had been around long enough to trust his instincts. And right now, they were telling him something wasn't right. He pushed open the front door, stepping inside and locking it behind him. His security system activated with a quiet beep, and he exhaled, rolling the tension out of his shoulders. Maybe he was just on edge. Maybe. Or maybe the game had just begun. The sun had barely risen when Shaq's phone started buzzing nonstop. Texts, calls, notifications. His entire digital world had exploded overnight. He sat in his massive kitchen, a cup of coffee in his hand, scrolling through his phone as the weight of the situation settled in. Shaq Cops was trending. Profiling or procedure was trending right alongside it. He tapped one of the news clips, watching himself on screen, standing in front of his truck as Officer Briggs questioned him. The angle was shaky, recorded from a bystander's phone. But it was clear enough. His frustration, the tension in the air, the way the officers surrounded him as if he were dangerous. The video had millions of views. The comment section was a war zone. This is ridiculous. That man is a legend, and they're treating him like a common criminal. Celebrity or not, nobody is above the law. If they had a report of a stolen truck, they had the right to question him. If that was a white man in a suit standing next to a Bentley, would this have even happened? Maybe Shaq should stop playing the victim and cooperate next time. Shaq exhaled, setting his phone down. It wasn't just about him anymore. It never was. At that same moment, in a dimly lit apartment across the city, the real thief was watching too. The man in the black hoodie leaned back in his chair, one foot propped up on his desk, scrolling through the same headlines Shaq had just seen. The smirk on his lips widened as he read the debates raging online. Perfect. This was exactly what he had wanted. A distraction. He clicked over to the next news story, the one no one was paying attention to. A billionaire tech mogul was hosting a private event that night. Security would be tight, cameras everywhere. But with all eyes locked on the Shaq controversy, the world was distracted. And distractions were opportunities. Back at Shaq's house, his longtime friend and agent, Kyle Mathers, paced across the living room, phone pressed to his ear. He was in full crisis mode. "Yeah, we're handling it," Kyle said, rubbing his temple. "No, we're not suing, at least not yet. Let's see how this plays out first." He hung up and turned to Shaq. "You need to say something. The media's eating this up, and right now, you're letting them control the story." Shaq took another sip of coffee. "Let them." Kyle groaned. "Come on, man. You know how this works. If you stay quiet, they'll spin it however they want. They're already bringing up old stuff, trying to make it seem like you've had run-ins with cops before." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "And have I?" Kyle hesitated, then shook his head. "Number. But facts don't matter right now. Narratives do." Shaq leaned back in his chair. He wasn't naive. He had been in the public eye for decades. He knew how quickly people turned, how fast a hero became a villain in the age of viral headlines. He tapped his phone, pulling up a sports talk show segment. A panel of analysts was discussing the incident. "This is a tricky situation," one of them said. "Was Shaq unfairly targeted? Maybe. But the police had a report of a stolen vehicle, and we can't just assume every case like this is about race." "But let's be real," another panelist interrupted. "This is racial profiling, plain and simple. Shaq was standing next to his own truck and they didn't believe him. You think Tom Brady or Elon Musk would have been treated the same way?" "It's more complicated than that," a third voice argued. "People are making this about race, but isn't it also about privilege? Shaq is rich, he's famous, he's used to people recognizing him. Maybe this was just a wake-up call that no one is above suspicion." Shaq shut the video off. It wasn't just about what happened anymore. It was about what it meant to different people, and he had no control over that. The LAPD held a press conference that afternoon. Officer Briggs wasn't there, but the department spokesperson stood at the podium, delivering a carefully worded statement. "This incident was unfortunate, and we understand the concerns raised by the public. However, our officers were responding to a reported vehicle theft. Their actions were in accordance with protocol, and there was no misconduct." Reporters fired questions immediately. If the vehicle was his, why did it take so long to confirm that? Why wasn't Shaquille O'Neal given the benefit of the doubt? Does the department acknowledge concerns of racial profiling in this case? The spokesperson dodged, repeating the same polished lines. Across the city, Shaq sat watching it unfold, shaking his head. They weren't going to admit anything. Meanwhile, the real thief was making his move. Dressed in all black, he blended into the staff at the billionaire's private event, slipping through the back halls like he belonged. He had planned this for weeks, mapping out exits, studying guard rotations. Security was focused on the main entrance, watching for outside threats. They never saw him coming from within. He made it to the underground parking lot, where rows of luxury cars sat untouched. Lamborghinis, Ferraris, Bentleys, all worth more than most people made in a lifetime. But he wasn't here for just any car. He had his eye on one in particular, a custom Rolls-Royce built for the billionaire himself, and tonight it was going to disappear. By the time the news broke about the Rolls-Royce theft, Shaq was already exhausted from the media circus. Kyle barged into the room, phone in hand. "You see this?" Shaq rubbed his eyes. "What now?" Kyle turned the screen toward him. "Breaking, multi-million-dollar Rolls-Royce, stolen from private event in Los Angeles, second high-end theft this week." Shaq sat up. "Same guy?" Kyle nodded. "Has to be. And guess what? No cops stopping random rich white guys outside the event. No misunderstandings. No unnecessary detainments. Just a clean getaway." Shaq exhaled through his nose. Of course. The real thief was still out there. And somehow Shaq had become the bigger story. He shook his head, setting his phone down. They were all playing different games. The media was playing the narrative game. The police were playing the defensive game. And somewhere in the city, the real criminal was playing the long game. Shaq wasn't sure how this would end, but he had a feeling this wasn't over, not even close. The early morning light filtered through Shaq's living room window, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. He sat on his couch, phone in hand, scrolling through yet another wave of headlines. The internet hadn't let up, not for a second. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a theory. His lawyer, Dominic Carter, had been calling non-stop since dawn. Shaq finally gave in, answering with a sigh. "Dom, I already know what you're gonna say." "You don't know half of it." Dominic's voice came through, tight with urgency. "You need to hear this in person. I'm coming over." Shaq ran a hand over his face, exhaustion settling in. He had spent his entire career fighting battles on the court. But this was something different. 30 minutes later, Dominic arrived, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something much sharper. He dropped a thick folder onto Shaq's kitchen counter. "You need to see this," Dominic said, flipping open the file. "Briggs isn't just some overzealous cop. He's got a pattern." Shaq leaned forward, scanning the documents. "Over the past 5 years," Dominic continued, "Briggs has been involved in multiple incidents involving successful black men, athletes, business owners, entertainers. You're not the first, Shaq. You're just the biggest name so far." Shaq's jaw tightened. "And no one's done anything about it?" Dominic scoffed. "Internal investigations, complaints that went nowhere, people settling out of court. You know how this works. But the thing is," he tapped a specific report. "One of his cases didn't go away. A businessman named Terrence Grayson fought back, filed a formal complaint against Briggs 3 months ago. And guess what?" Shaq frowned. "What?" Dominic exhaled. "Grayson's complaint disappeared. Buried. And 2 weeks later, he got hit with a fraud investigation that killed his business. Coincidence?" Shaq didn't believe in coincidences. He exhaled, his fingers tapping against the counter. "All right, let's go public with it. Let's put all of this out there." Dominic hesitated. "That's the problem, Shaq." He pulled out his phone and slid it across the counter. "We might be too late." Shaq looked at the screen. A breaking news banner flashed across the top. LAPD Officer Kellen Briggs, missing. Briggs had vanished. No one knew where he had gone, and the department was keeping their lips tight. Some sources claimed he had taken a sudden leave of absence. Others hinted at something darker. But Shaq had a gut feeling. Someone had made him disappear. The real question was why. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, in an abandoned warehouse near the docks, the real thief sat at an old metal table, flipping a playing card between his fingers. The Queen of Spades, his calling card. He tapped the card against the table, watching as the dim light flickered overhead. Across from him, a burner phone sat beside a laptop displaying the latest news about Briggs's disappearance. "Predictable," the man murmured, his voice laced with amusement. He reached into his hoodie and pulled out a small, folded note. Handwritten. He had gone through too much trouble to set this game in motion. Now it was time to make the next move. He placed the note carefully inside a black envelope and sealed it shut. Then, with a smirk, he stood up and disappeared into the shadows. The next morning, a security guard at Shaq's estate found the envelope tucked into the iron gate. No return address, no name, just a simple black seal. Shaq opened it in his kitchen, Dominic standing beside him. Inside was the note, 6 words written in perfect, slanted handwriting. "This was never about your truck." Shaq stared at the note, his heartbeat steady but his mind racing. "What the hell does that mean?" Dominic muttered. Shaq didn't know, but something told him. He was about to find out. Shaq sat in his living room, staring at the note left at his gate. "This was never about your truck." The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. Across from him, Dominic paced, running a hand through his short cropped hair. "This is bad, man. Briggs is missing, the cops look incompetent, and now this? Someone's playing a game and you're right in the middle of it." Shaq exhaled, leaning back in his oversized leather chair. He had been in plenty of high-pressure situations before. Game 7s, championship runs, business deals worth millions. But this was different. This wasn't about basketball or endorsements. This was personal. His phone buzzed, another news alert. He picked it up, already knowing it wasn't going to be good. Breaking. High-profile businessman's sports car stolen. Suspect resembles Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq's jaw tightened as he clicked on the video attached to the article. The footage was grainy, but the figure in the dark hoodie, moving swiftly in the shadows, was huge. Broad shoulders, towering frame. The kind of build only a few men could carry. And it looked like him. Dominic cursed under his breath. "You gotta be kidding me." Shaq stayed quiet, watching as the figure in the footage approached the luxury sports car, a Ferrari sleek and low to the ground, before slipping inside with shocking ease. Within seconds, the engine roared, and the car was gone. The video cut out. The screen flashed back to the news anchor, a polished-looking woman with a serious expression. Police are reviewing the footage, but speculation has already begun. Is Shaquille O'Neal being framed? Or is there more to this story than meets the eye? Shaq turned the phone over, face down, and let out a slow breath. "They're trying to set you up," Dominic said, stating the obvious. "Someone's orchestrating this and they're damn good at it." Shaq rubbed his temples. "The question is, why? What's the end game here?" Across the city, in a dimly lit office filled with the hum of old computers, Detective Eleanor Vargas leaned forward, replaying the surveillance footage frame by frame. She had been a cop for over 15 years. She had seen her share of setups, of cases that didn't add up. But this had layers. She zoomed in, watching the figure move. The posture, the stride. It was eerily close to O'Neal's. Almost too close. Vargas had met Shaq once, briefly. He had spoken at a community event a few years back. The man was impossible to miss, and even more impossible to mistake for someone else. And yet, she tapped her pen against the desk, eyes narrowing at the footage. Something felt off. Meanwhile, Shaq's inner circle was starting to splinter. Kyle, his agent, was in full crisis mode. He paced Shaq's home office, throwing out worst-case scenarios like they were free samples. "We have to get ahead of this," Kyle insisted. "We need a statement, a legal strategy, maybe even an alibi." Shaq gave him a sharp look. "You think I did this?" Kyle hesitated. "No, man. Of course not. But people are going to ask. Hell, people are already asking. We need to be prepared." Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I was here when that car got stolen. I didn't leave my damn house all night. You know that." Kyle sighed, rubbing his face. "I know. But the court of public opinion doesn't care about the truth. They care about what they see. And right now they see a 7-foot dude in a hoodie stealing cars." Shaq clenched his fists. He wasn't used to feeling helpless. He wasn't used to playing defense off the court. But someone had him right where they wanted him, and he needed to figure out who. Fast. Shaq was staring at the chaos unfolding on his phone screen. Every major news outlet was covering the story. The stolen sports car, the surveillance footage, the missing cop. His name was being dragged through the mud, and the worst part? He still didn't know who was behind it. Enough was enough. He wasn't about to sit back and let someone take him down. With a deep breath, he tapped a contact on his phone. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "You finally calling me back?" Cameron Brooks sounded amused, but there was a sharpness beneath his tone. "I was starting to think you liked being the bad guy in this story." Cameron was an investigative journalist, one of the best in the business. He didn't just report the news. He exposed the truth. If anyone could help Shaq, it was him. "You still got those contacts inside LAPD?" Shaq asked. Cameron chuckled. "I got eyes everywhere, big man. What are we looking for?" Shaq leaned forward, voice steady. "Who's framing me? And what the hell is the real play here?" Across town, in a dimly lit bar that smelled of whiskey and regret, Detective Eleanor Vargas sipped her drink, lost in thought. She wasn't the kind of cop who ignored her gut, and right now, her gut was screaming. The stolen cars, the suspicious disappearance of Officer Briggs, the way Shaq had been caught in the middle of it all. It wasn't adding up. A shadow fell over her table. She looked up to see a tall man with sharp eyes and an easy smirk. "Detective Vargas," Cameron Brooks said smoothly, sliding into the seat across from her. "I hear you're asking the same questions I am." Vargas raised an eyebrow. That depends. Who's asking? Cameron pulled out his phone, tapping the screen. A grainy photo appeared. Briggs, standing next to a man in an expensive suit. Vargas frowned. Who's that? Cameron leaned in. That detective is Vincent Carlisle. Billionaire, real estate mogul. And, if my sources are right, the guy pulling the strings behind this whole mess. Vargas narrowed her eyes. She had heard the name before. Carlisle had his hands in everything. Construction, tech, high-end imports. But she had never seen his name linked to criminal activity. Cameron slid a folder across the table. Start here, and when you're ready to stop playing by LAPD's rules, call me. He stood up, tossing a few bills on the table before walking out. Vargas stared at the folder for a long moment before flipping it open. What she saw made her blood run cold. Back at Shaq's house, Cameron laid everything out. Vincent Carlisle wasn't just a businessman. He was running an underground human trafficking operation, using high-end stolen vehicles to move people across state lines without raising suspicion. Shaq listened, his expression unreadable. Briggs was part of it, Cameron continued. He made sure cops looked the other way. And when you got stopped that night, that wasn't random. That was a distraction. Shaq frowned. A distraction from what? Vargas, who had just arrived, answered. From the real crime that was happening across the city while everyone was focused on you. Shaq exhaled. So what now? Cameron leaned forward. Now we make a move. But you have to decide. Do we take this to the press, or do we take it straight to Carlisle? Shaq didn't even hesitate. We take it to him. The next evening, under the glow of a city skyline, Shaq stepped into Vincent Carlisle's penthouse. Carlisle was waiting, lounging in a leather chair, a glass of whiskey in hand. He smirked as Shaq approached. I was wondering when you'd come knocking. Shaq didn't sit. You set me up. Carlisle tilted his head. Did I? Shaq's voice was calm, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. I know about the stolen cars, I know about the trafficking, and I know Briggs was covering for you. Carlisle chuckled. You're a smart man, Shaquille, but you're also in a position where you have to make a choice. You can fight this, drag it into the light, make a lot of noise, or you can walk away and let this all disappear. Shaq held his gaze. You really think I'm the kind of man who walks away from this? Carlisle swirled the whiskey in his glass. I think you're the kind of man who values his legacy. And if this goes public, it won't just be my name in the headlines. It'll be yours. And you know how fast people turn on their heroes. Shaq's jaw tightened. Carlisle wasn't just threatening him, he was challenging him. But what Carlisle didn't know was that Shaq had already made his move. His phone was on, the call with Cameron and Vargas still running. Everything Carlisle had just said, recorded. Shaq stepped back, giving him one last look. You're done. And with that, he walked out, leaving Vincent Carlisle to watch as everything he had built came crashing down. Shaq had played the game smart, recorded Vincent Carlisle's confession, and handed the evidence over to Cameron and Detective Vargas. Within hours, the media had exploded. A billionaire real estate mogul running a human trafficking operation, using stolen luxury cars as cover. It was a scandal of epic proportions. Carlisle's arrest was imminent. Shaq should have felt relief, but something still didn't sit right. There was a missing piece, a loose thread he couldn't ignore. His phone rang. It was Vargas. You need to get to the station, she said, her voice sharp. Now. 20 minutes later, Shaq walked into the LAPD precinct, ducking his head slightly to avoid hitting the doorframe. He spotted Vargas near the back, her arms crossed, staring at a monitor. Cameron stood beside her, scrolling through his phone. What's going on? Shaq asked, his gut tightening. Vargas gestured toward the screen. Security footage. A grainy image of a man standing in a dimly lit parking garage, speaking with Officer Briggs. Shaq leaned in. Who's that? Vargas hesitated, then looked at Cameron. Shaq's agent, Kyle Mathers, appeared on screen. Shaq's stomach dropped. Kyle was in on it. Betrayal felt like a slow, creeping sickness. Shaq sat in Vargas's office, staring at his hands, trying to process the information. Kyle, his agent, His friend, the man who had been by his side for years, had been working with Carlyle. "You sure about this?" Shaq finally asked. His voice was steady, but inside, he was unraveling. Cameron slid his phone across the table. "He took a payout, Shaq. He helped Carlyle control the media narrative, leaked just enough misinformation to keep you distracted. He wasn't just managing your career. He was managing the cover-up." Shaq clenched his jaw. He thought back to Kyle's constant pushing for statements, urging him to stay quiet, to be careful. It had all been about control, all about protecting Carlyle. Shaq exhaled sharply. "Where is he now?" Vargas stood. "We're about to find out." Later that night, Kyle Mathers stepped out of his office building, phone in hand, oblivious to the black SUV parked across the street. Shaq sat in the back seat, watching. When Kyle turned the corner, Shaq stepped out. "Kyle." Kyle froze. His phone nearly slipped from his fingers. "Shaq, what are you—" Shaq didn't let him finish. "You lied to me." Kyle opened his mouth, but no words came out. "You set me up to take the fall," Shaq continued, his voice even. "You worked with Carlyle. You made sure I stayed distracted while you helped cover for him." Kyle swallowed hard. "I had no choice, man." Shaq took a step closer. "You always had a choice, and you chose money over loyalty." Kyle glanced around like he was looking for an exit. "Shaq, listen, Save it," Shaq said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding up the screen. Kyle's voice played over the speaker. A recording. His voice, clear as day, discussing payouts, media strategy, how to keep Shaq's hands tied. Kyle's face went pale. "You're done," Shaq said. "Turn yourself in, or I make sure the whole world hears this." Kyle knew he was trapped. His shoulders sagged. He took a shaky breath. And then, for the first time, Shaq saw it. True regret in his eyes. But regret didn't erase betrayal. Kyle nodded. "I'll do the right thing." But Shaq knew better than to trust him now. By morning, the headlines had changed. Billionaire Vincent Carlyle arrested in human trafficking scandal. LAPD officer linked to corrupt network found dead. Was it a cover-up? Shaq's own agent involved in setup. Full investigation underway. Shaq had turned the media storm around. He had exposed them all. But the scars remained. As he watched the city move outside his window, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about justice. It was about making sure this never happened again. The truth isn't always what it seems, and neither is justice. What happens when power, corruption, and deception collide? Shaq fought back. But would you? The game isn't over. The next move is yours. Stay sharp, stay questioning. Because the real story is never just what they tell you.